Every generation has nostalgia for their adolescent years. We often hear the phrase, the good old days, and when we do, we are transported back to simpler times. For instance, when I hear one of the classic Christmas songs, whether that be Frosty the Snowman, White Christmas, or It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, I'm reminded of the yearly traditions I used to uphold. Like watching the classic claymation Christmas movies on TBS or CBS, or going sledding on a big hill in a park near my childhood home, or making those Pillsbury cookies that came in a long tube and stealing some of the cookie dough to get a taste before they were fully cooked. Now, there's definitely an argument to be made about why holidays like Christmas don't feel the same anymore, with the main reasoning being that we're all just getting older, and while that is certainly true, I don't think that paints the entire picture. Traditions require societies to silently agree on maintaining the actions that keep traditions alive. And even though many of us still go home for the holidays, hang up our trees and stockings, and eat a big Christmas dinner, the neighborly community aspect feels much less apparent. It was common to attend church on Christmas Eve and have gift-giving ceremonies and pageants for the children attending. I personally remember the Christmas plays that I had to participate in school. I remember being a little angel with his hands like this. Family letters and handwritten Christmas cards would happen every year too, but numbers are showing that less and less Americans are doing this. It seems that less people are talking to their neighbors around the holidays, and Christmas music would also play on every radio and television station. But now, this seems increasingly hard to find. To me, this marks an important shift in our culture, from one of shared values to a favoring of individual pursuits and beliefs. So today, I want to explore how our culture, specifically in America, although a lot of this could be attributed to the entire world right now, has changed, how it's fueled much of the younger generation's mental health crisis, and the hopeful shift emerging that could be a potential solution. Let's get one thing straight. Traditions are naturally subject to change over time. I'm sure we can all agree on this. What was once considered socially acceptable in our culture is bound to be cast aside when we start gaining tools with which to question those parts of our culture. But for a long time, it wasn't really like this. In order to talk about what causes cultures to change, philosophers, historians, and sociologists usually divide the last few hundred years or so into three eras: pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. These terms are a little hard to define accurately, and they change depending on the context, but I'm going to do my best to talk about them in their relation to culture. And by culture, I mean the values, behaviors, beliefs, and symbols that a society accepts. Pre-modernity can best be summarized by very little change, tightly knit rural groups, no separation between church and state, and a strong belief in God. In the pre-modern era of societies, which are usually defined between like 1,000 to 1,500, although you could go like all the way back to the time that societies first existed, what you could achieve in your lifetime was largely determined by your heritage. Birth status reigned supreme, so if you were born into a wealthy family, there was almost no chance of you losing that wealth. Conversely, if you were born amongst the lower ranks of society, there was essentially no chance for you to break out of your poverty-stricken life. And due to this, you could argue that it was much easier to accept one's fate, which is going to be way more important when we talk about the present day later in the video. Cultural norms were well established and remained unchanged. Feudal lords ruled over lands, princes would inherit the king's crown, marry to noblewomen, and ensure they would have an heir to the throne by reproducing only with those of high rank. Depictions of pre-modern times in media, such as Marco Polo, The King, and Vikings, are great examples of different cultures' ranking systems. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Social classes exist today too. We all are ranked somewhere in our social class based on our upbringing and wealth, just like pre-modern times. But there's a big difference here. Yes, technically in some societies, you could go up or down in the ranks, but for the vast majority of people, whatever rank you got at the start of your life was set in stone until the day you die, which is much less true today. No matter where you rank in our current society, you have that sort of freedom to break out of your inherited class and achieve more wealth. Although I know that some of you would argue that that sort of freedom is an illusion. I'd also imagine that it was easier to accept one's fate that they were given due to the fact that humans considered themselves to be sacred and at the center of the universe during this time. So, in other words, most cultures involved traditions that revolved around gods. Myths, gods, and symbolism dominated the beliefs of pre-modern societies, as no tools to question what is prayed to existed. I think the verse Romans 12:1 in the Bible is a good representation of the attitude of most cultures in the world during this time. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. The chances of your daily lifestyle changing from day to day or year to year and questioning the culture of your upbringing was close to zero. But sometime after the Middle Ages, depending on who you ask, and again the exact date doesn't really matter, a new cultural shift on the earth was forming. A shift of discovery, reason, and progress. The age of modernity. When I use the word modern here, I'm not referring to the formal definition, which is a relation to the present times. I'm talking about a specific cultural attitude. As we started to create the tools for which we could observe the universe, we started to lean towards a more objective view of understanding things. The validity and cruelness of certain traditions started to become questioned as excuses for actions hidden behind God's doing were exposed. Illnesses that were once thought to be incurable became possible to alleviate. The church and state started to separate, and people were given the choice to believe in what they choose to believe. There was a general sense that humans could start making progress to improve our conditions through the use of scientific analysis and reasoning, and this progress was generally known as Enlightenment, aka the scientific revolution in Europe. The Industrial Revolution spawned a mass uproar in urbanization, and the development of different technologies was seen as evidence that reason and rationality could help humans achieve the most perfect, equal state of being. The phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from the US is a succinct way to describe the general outlook of many developing countries, and therefore cultures. Like, imagine you're born into a world where, for the first time, fast, significant progress at a vast scale is being made. After thousands of years, humans were finally capable of drastically changing their circumstances, creating inventions that reverberated through the entire world, like the light bulb, bikes, planes, cars, and telephones, and all of this allowed us to interact with one another no matter where we were located. No longer was a faith in the unknown and the divine needed. All could be figured out with enough time and effort put into the sciences. It was also the age of democracy. Slavery was being banned, women were getting the right to vote, and more distance was being placed between authoritarian governments. The underlying inequality of traditions in pre-modern civilizations were questioned and expelled to make more room for every member of society to have a say in how laws were conducted, thus increasing autonomy. These changes were clearly exemplified in how expressionistic and individualistic certain parts of culture like art became. When traditions were upheld and beauty and art took on a singular meaning, as was the case in pre-modern times, artists usually only attempted to depict realism in their pieces. But during the modern movement, artists like Picasso and Vincent van Gogh depicted life in unorthodox and often self-conscious ways, because they no longer had a strong fear of being ostracized for breaking the pre-modern conventions of culture. Your life was now dependent on how you decided you wanted to live it, and the hope in a grand narrative, aka something that seeks to explain an absolute truth about how the world and how society should be best structured, was making strides through logic and reason. The hopes that things would continue to get better for everyone spread throughout many cultures. So when the second half of the 20th century hit, people started growing increasingly more skeptical of the idea of enlightenment and utopian perfection. Thus, the postmodern era of culture was about to begin. It turns out the promises that science and reason instilled into us were full of false hope. The rapidly changing technology was used to control and divide the population instead of set more of us free. Advanced warfare against other countries became a battle of who can develop the next most powerful thing the fastest. And while the old powers and systems of governing over others, like monarchies and aristocrats, died down, what took its place wasn't a democracy run by the people. Instead, the new monarchies were the tycoons and the banks. A handful of companies control most of the consumer product market and value profits over individual rights. Politics has become a game of who can market themselves the best instead of who can make the biggest positive impact. And almost in the same way that symbolism and mysticism ruled over pre-modern times, a new form of symbolism created a veil over reality that modernity sought to disprove. hyperreality. Hyperreality, which I've now talked about in several videos, is the inability to distinguish reality from a simulation of reality. John Baudrillard, the philosopher who coined the term hyperreality, put postmodern culture like this. Post-modernity is said to be a culture of fragmentary sensations, eclectic nostalgia, disposable simulacra, and promiscuous superficiality, in which the traditionally valued qualities of depth, coherence, meaning, originality, and authenticity are evacuated or dissolved amid the random swirl of empty signals. In other words, things are no longer evaluated on how useful they are or how objectively true they are, but rather the abstract idea that they represent. Our current world is full of examples of simulations. VR, social media, adult websites, resorts like Las Vegas and Disneyland, and high fashion brands that don't actually make higher quality items like Gucci, Prada, and Ray-Ban all represent a distorted version of what actually exists in reality. This has spread throughout our newly globalized world, as the issues of cultures on the other side of the world started to influence the issues of cultures on the opposite side. I've been kind of speaking about postmodernism in the past tense, but the fact remains that a lot of people and cultures are still stuck in this postmodern attitude. An attitude characterized by a cynicism of progress and skepticism that science and reason is the solver of all problems. An attitude of confusion about which path or truths can really be verified due to the globalization of information and access to any given opinion we want at our fingertips. And as a result, our culture can be heavily defined by a mistrust in our fellow humans. Nobody really agrees with each other. Every company feels like it's a scam trying to get you to spend money, and hyper-individualism has dissolved community and cooperation. Your daily tasks feel vapid, your identity changes with each new internet trend, your food isn't real, and it feels almost impossible for any real traditions to be established anymore. Because traditions require years of doing the same things over and over in a community-like setting. But now, one could argue that things change too rapidly to the point where we can't even establish a tradition, because before we can even just do a thing repeatedly, we are on to doing the next thing. Postmodern life has become so fractured and complex that most young people, they just don't even know what to believe in anymore, because they don't believe in neither God nor science fully. And so for some people, usually associated with the right-wing side of politics, the answer is to go back to simpler times like our pre-modern era. According to them, we need to put our faith back into God, go to church, and replace our newfound nihilism with old habits. We need to go back to the traditions that once made life simple, understandable, and hopeful. And honestly, I don't blame people for wanting to revert our culture back to that. Ironically, we now have the science to prove that most people who are religious tend to be more satisfied with their lives than their non-religious counterparts, probably due in part to the community aspect and faith that your life deeply means something. But if we just go back to our old traditions without changing anything, we will also inherit the inequality and injustice that was present during our pre-modern times. For other people, they're trying to fight for the liberty, freedom, and equality that was promised with modernity. This is usually categorized as those associated with liberal ideologies who are focused on progressivism, individualism, and greater autonomy. To these people, so long as we give everyone an opportunity to do anything or be anything that they want, just like modernity promised, then we will reach the satisfaction that we tried to reach in modernity, and everything will be fine. But if we let hyper-individualism remain the norm, then nobody will agree on anything, and social cohesion will become extremely difficult to achieve. The clash between the right and left sides of thinking has only seemed to make things more complicated and more divided, but amidst all these thought bubbles and groupthinks, a new culture has been emerging through the internet. Within the past couple decades, we are now seeing a rise of what is called Metamodernism. And I think it is the best culture fit for someone who grew up in the smartphone era. The meta in metamodernism comes from the Greek word metaxis, which essentially means in-betweenness, and that's exactly what metamodernism is. While modernism was defined by absolute truths and hope, and postmodernism was defined by individualism, subjectivity, and hopelessness, metamodernism is a cultural response that attempts to integrate the two through pragmatic idealism. A formal definition of metamodernism would be something along the lines of a cultural expression of the optimism from modernism with the added nihilism and skepticism of postmodernism. By now, we all know that naive optimism in science and reason won't fix all of our problems. For every problem that we do solve, we just produce another problem which is sometimes better and sometimes worse. For example, when we solved the problem of being able to feed most people on Earth through industrial agriculture, we also created part of the problem of climate change. But at the same time, we gotta understand that making no progress, believing in nothing, and having no singular narrative also isn't useful. If we realize that both ideas can coexist and be useful, depending on how one presents solutions to our current problems of meaning, mental health, and inequality, maybe we can start to have a culture that provides the freedom that modernity promised, while still having a bit of skepticism and nuance in ideas that seem absolute. Instead of just saying, soon we will have all the answers, we just need to follow the science and reason, or just saying, none of this shit matters, science hasn't actually made us happy and now everything is hopeless, you say, yeah, sometimes science is subject to changing or being invalidated, and yeah, shit feels like it doesn't matter sometimes, but there's still things we can do to improve our condition in this incredibly dull and dreary world. Speaking strictly from a cultural sense, I think this is how you build the most trust and hope between people in the younger generations, and I've seen this play out a ton in internet culture. Like, think of the ways in which we cope with our mental health and crisis issues. For a lot of us, it's through memes. We acknowledge the wrongdoings of humanity and all the crazy shit going on in the world, but through ironic sincerity in the forms of GIFs, images, or short videos. This expression of culture is neither nihilistic nor ignorantly optimistic. It gets the point across without coming off as too serious, while hopefully finding a solution somewhere within the midst of it. And even for inherently productive things, like things that aren't even related to like the mental health crisis or other crises, this is now the case too. This is how things are presented. I've been getting these AI-generated voices of celebrities like Andrew Tate and Taylor Swift explaining math problems to people on Instagram Reels.
So this is the Taylor series. It's a tool we use in math to turn scary functions into friendly polynomials.
I don't know if there's any better way to exude the metamodernistic attitude than that. And from my personal experience, if you're trying to communicate an idea to Gen Z, Gen Alpha, or even young millennials, you cannot take yourself too seriously and act like you have the absolute truth to everything. To them, that will just feel cringe and feel too forced and marketed. So instead, in my content, I actively make an effort to scatter jokes or irony about my own problems and solutions, while at the same time appealing to their deep desire for hope. And that is what writers on metamodern culture call ironic sincerity. As these two writers on metamodern culture, that I'm not even going to try to begin to pronounce their names, put it, indeed, if simplistically put, the modern outlook of idealism and ideals could be characterized as fanatic and or naive, and the postmodern mindset as apathetic and or skeptic, the current generation's attitude, for it is, and very much so, an attitude tied to a generation, can be conceived as a kind of informed naivety, a pragmatic idealism. In short, yes, there were things brought about by modernism like a greater freedom of expression and autonomy that were good, but the idea that we could fix everything was inherently flawed. And there were things about postmodernism that brought to light the issues with the modern culture and helped us question things considered to be objective truths, but remaining hopeless and seeing the world as doomed is also flawed. So if we take what was great about both of these things, so we have something to be striving towards while always in the back of our mind, remaining a bit nuanced and skeptic, then we can start to make real progress on the problems of the 21st century. Look, I know all of this might seem complicated. Present-day life is very complicated and full of different lifestyles and paths and potential rabbit holes on YouTube to get sucked down and waste a whole day on, but you can still have faith and believe in a certain baseline set of values you think everyone should live by, while giving people the opportunity to explore what this life really means to them. And this is why I'm such a heavy promoter of nuanced thinking. I know how important it is to have both a strong community with shared values and your own individualistic pursuits, both faith in a higher power and faith in scientific discovery, and both optimism for the future and skepticism for it too. And because there are so many knowns, unknowns, lies, and truths revealed in the past few hundred years, causing confusion amongst the masses, I don't think there's any better way to approach life in the 21st century and beyond. A lot of our old traditions have died out, yes, but hopefully we can continue to extract the utility from past traditional values and create improved versions of them in the future. But I don't know, I'm just some random dude yapping on the internet, just as lost as you are. See what I did there? Hey guys, if you want to discuss topics in a nuanced manner about things that actually matter in life and will make you happier and more fulfilled and stuff like that, you can check out my free self-improvement community, which is linked in the description below. And if you like my video essays on modern issues, check out the playlist right here. Keep binging my videos. You need to keep watching my videos. It makes me money. I need money so I can pay rent and be happy. But then the payoff is that you're not happy because you're binge watching a bunch of videos. How do I compromise here? All right, I'm gonna go. Bye.